Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Fernandez, and on behalf of Inago Academy and as part of Peer Review Week 2020, I welcome you all to Inago's panel discussion in collaboration with leading academic publishing houses such as Wiley, IOP Publishing, and Kargar Publishers. This discussion today will focus on the policies and provisions followed by journals and publishers to reinforce the peer review system. Today, we have with us Michael Willis, Senior Manager and Researcher Advocate from Wiley, in his role as Senior Manager, Peer Review for all of Wiley's in-house EMEA editorial offices. Michael oversees the development and implementation of peer review best practices across all disciplines and peer review models. Since October 2019, he has also been a researcher advocate within Wiley's content review team, promoting the work and functions of researchers as editors, peer reviewers, and authors. Michael has also been the president of the International Society of Managing and Technical Editors in 2016 and 2017. Our next panelist is Kim Eggleton, Research Integrity and Inclusion Manager from IOP Publishing. With over 15 years of experience in the scholarly publishing industry across both humanities and social sciences, as well as STEM domains, Kim is especially interested in peer review and the role of ethics and diversity within the broader publishing system. Our final panelist today is Christina Chapp, Head of Editorial Development from Kargar Publishers. Krishna oversees the journal publication, ethics, and editorial policies for Kargar. Prior to joining Kargar, she worked as a journal editor handling peer review for various academic journals, including PLOS Medicine, PLOS One, and several BMC series journals like Biomed Central. And finally, a little background about myself. I'm a publishing professional working with Inago Academy and have been actively involved in developing comprehensive and easy to understand resources for academic researchers and assisting them in their publication journey. Additionally, as part of Inago's Global Research Risk Assessment Initiative, I work on identifying, assessing, and raising awareness of global risk factors that potentially affect the scholarly research community. Now that we've done with the introduction, I'll give a formal welcome to all our panelists. I hope you're having all a great day. Before we initiate and get into the panel discussion, I'd like to give you all a brief introduction about Inago. Inago is the world's leading author services provider, and our author first, quality first approach ensures that our authors receive only the best quality output and excellent user experience at all times. This unrelenting focus on authors' needs means that we never compromise on our quality systems and processes at any cost. All our services are designed keeping in mind the author's needs, beginning with Inago Academy, which is our author training platform, which educates authors through several resources, including webinars such as this, as well as live workshop sessions. We also have an e-learning platform for researchers called Inago Learn, along with a live one-on-one consultation platform called Inago Consult. Apart from that, Inago also offers world-class services to researchers which are at different stages of their research career, such as two-editor system, English language editing services, academic and non-academic translation services, manuscript preparation, and publication support services. The Inago promise guarantees that a manuscript edited by us will never be rejected based on poor language. On a rare occasion, if rejections occur, we will take full responsibility for re-editing the paper for resubmission at no additional cost. Inago's comprehensive after-sales services will support you at every step of the way until your manuscript is published. They're designed to take care of every need from the time you receive our main services until you have published your paper. Finally, Inago's research communication services are designed to help you effectively present your research data. In case you are interested in any of these services, feel free to email us at academy@inago.com. Now, before we get into the discussion with all our panelists, I would like to take you through a brief overview of the peer review process, which is followed by academic journals. The main aim for every researcher is to get published in a top tier journal. And this cannot always be the case where researchers do tend to face rejections. Now, one of the prime importance, this definitely is very disappointing when a researcher gets their paper rejected. However, the process of peer review is critical and plays an important role in ensuring that only validated scientific knowledge is made available to everyone. This peer review process begins when the manuscript is submitted by the author to the target journal. At the journal, the journal editor evaluates the manuscripts as part of a desk review system and checks if the manuscript is suitable from the journal requirement point of view. Once it passes that stage, the editor then assigns reviewers to minutely check the content of the paper and the actual science behind the research. Researchers then evaluate different aspects of the paper and provide their comments in the form of a comprehensive and detailed peer review report. This report is then shared with the journal editorial team, after which a final resolution is made. It could either be a reject, which means the manuscript did not meet the quality requirements or the requirements of science for that particular journal, or it can be accepted and then sent to production for publication. Or the last option is it can be sent back to the author for minor revisions or major revisions, which can then be evaluated again and checked for publication availability. So that is a brief overview about the peer review process. We will now start today's discussion with the following question to all our panelists, and we will begin with Kim Eggleton. Kim, what according to you are the selection criteria that are followed for appointing reviewers? A manuscript is generally sent how many reviewers?
So the selection criteria is broadly the same across all of our journals. Ultimately, we're looking for subject expertise. So the reviewer has to be experienced and knowledgeable about the topics that are being discussed in the paper. But there are some other important aspects as well. So we're looking for our reviewers to be independent. So that means that they don't have any conflict of interest with the authors regarding the paper that's been put forward. We also want the reviewers to be available. So, for example, if they're already reviewing other manuscripts, we try not to bother them. So we try to look for reviewers that we know are not working at least on other reviews for us at the time. And we also have a look at the reliability of a reviewer. So we can see within our submission system whether somebody has reviewed for us before, whether that review was timely, whether it was good quality. But that doesn't mean that we don't approach people that haven't reviewed for us before. Everybody has to do their first review sometime. So we are frequently going out to reviewers that haven't worked with us before. And to answer the second question, a manuscript is generally sent to 2 reviewers on our journals. That does vary slightly depending on both the journal and the paper. So for example, if 2 of our reviewers have quite differing opinions on what potential changes should be made to a manuscript, we might go out to a 3rd reviewer to act as a kind of adjudicator on the paper to give our editor a better sort of steer as to what should happen to that papers. But the standard for our journals is 2 reviewers per paper.
All right, that is great. Michael, would you like to add a few points?
I echo everything that Kim said, actually. We follow the same at Wiley. Just one other thing to add about the number of reviewers. I guess increasingly we're seeing a lot of multidisciplinary work. And in those cases, it's quite helpful to have more reviewers who represent all the different disciplines and, for example, statistical expertise as well, or modeling expertise, data scientists, that sort of thing. So you go to as many reviewers as you need to almost to get the relevant expertise.
All right. Krishna, would you like to add a few of your points?
Yes, I mean, we roughly follow the same criteria as Kim and Michael have mentioned. The only point I could elaborate a little bit on is the competing interest or the conflict of interest that Kim mentioned. I think we rely on both information that is available to us in terms of maybe co-authorship if the authors have recently published with the others, but we also have to rely on information from the potential reviewers to tell us, okay, we are currently collaborating and we haven't published yet, and then maybe there is no public record of that collaboration. So we also count on their transparency in telling us actually we are having a close collaboration at the moment, therefore I should actually remove myself from this reviewing process. So I think it's a conjunction of things that we can check ourselves, but also that people have to disclose at some point. And just to add briefly on the point of the number of reviewers, I think the multidisciplinarity has been mentioned. I think for us, particularly for medical journals, sometimes you have papers that are sort of translational, and so you do sometimes need the perspective of the clinician and sometimes the perspective of a basic scientist together. So it could influence whether you do need 2 or 3 reviews in certain cases.
All right. So just in addition to this question, related to it, at times there are young authors that want to review for certain papers and for journals. If let's assume as a fact that there is an author that is reviewing for the very first time, would journals really give him papers directly, or how does it work in that sense?
Yeah, so we are quite open to inviting people to review who haven't done that before. We have quite an extensive reviewer training program, which actually just launched this week. And we would really encourage people to look at that to understand exactly what's expected of a reviewer. But we will always, help reviewers where needed. So if anybody's completing their first review and has questions, we would absolutely encourage them to contact us, contact the editor, and we will help wherever we can.
All right. I think we can move to the next question. So this one is from Michael. So just to give you an overview before we get to the question, going by the theme for this year's peer review week, which is trust in peer review, what do you think are the critical issues in the existing peer review system that need to be addressed, to build trust among authors and reviewers? Now, as part of the peer review week, INAGO is conducting a global peer review survey where we are evaluating the impact of the global pandemic on the peer review process. And the data that you see on the slide right now is initial early data from the survey that we are conducting, which shows you some of the critical issues that are currently present in the peer review system. So, Michael, can you add, your thoughts on what are some of the issues?
Yeah, I think the slide gives very good, very revealing responses actually. But I would say that the publishers can really help to solve all of these problems. So, for example, careful selection of peer reviewers can help with the problem of bias. Different models of anonymizing the peer review process or even making it totally transparent can help there as well. Providing clear and robust guidelines for reviewers, avoiding conflicts of interest, freeing up reviewers to comment on innovative scientific aspects. I think science is almost intrinsically a very conservative field, and we need to encourage reviewers to think outside the box. Publishers can help reviewers there. And using technology to provide quality assurance and to do things more quickly. So, for example, an image screening or text similarity checks. What's interesting to me, coming from from a publisher is that authors tell us that the main problems are delay, so we've got slow process there, but also unhelpful peer review reports. And I think it's interesting that that hasn't come up here. I suppose quality and consistency might come up, but authors really appreciate having constructive, helpful peer review reports to make their papers better. But I think it's useful to take a big picture view, and it really does go back not just to the peer review process and to submitting your paper to a journal, but right back to where the research is conducted. So a lot of efforts have happened recently to focus on how you do things at the bench level, quality of methodology, the quality of the data, and where you store your data and how you curate the data. Those are really important things as well. But I don't think we should be afraid to evolve new solutions. I was reminded just recently that back in the Royal Society, the first journals first scholarly journals to be published, it was quite often the case that non-experts would act as reviewers for journals. They would just get, respected people, but not necessarily people who knew the subject to look over papers, and that was quite common. Well, we've come a long way from there, thankfully, and we now do have peer review processes that are much more robust than that. And I don't think we should be afraid to evolve new solutions. The last thing I'd say is that there does need to be, above all, transparency about the process. Transparency is a massive theme at the moment, isn't it, with the COVID lockdown and the public quite rightly wanting to know what the science is behind government policies and so on. There needs to be transparency there. Especially true in peer review, there should be transparency of process. In other words, what happens in the process, and transparency about the people involved in the process, who's taking the decisions, who's taking the action. So there's some critical issues there, but I think there are solutions that are going, and I think we have a role as publishers to play in helping things to adapt to engender greater trust in the peer review process.
Definitely. So Michael, just as an addition, as you can see on the data that is there in the slide, slow process as well as bias, these are the highest ranking currently from the initial data that we have from the survey. At Wiley, I'm sure a lot of our authors that are watching this panel discussion will want to know what is it that Wiley does, to tackle these issues of either the slow process of peer review or bias that is there, especially towards ESL authors when they are publishing the papers.
Sure. Well, where we can, we are looking at ways of making the peer review process more transparent, but also recognizing that different disciplines operate in different ways. So there are some disciplines where it's more appropriate for there to be double-blind review happening, and others where a totally open process works effectively. So we're being sensitive to different disciplines, but we're also tackling issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, which are obviously really important at the moment, always have been, but especially they're in the front of people's minds at the moment. So that those things will go to help tackle bias. For slow process, I think it's a complex problem here because there are different elements in the process of peer review and publication which happen. There are elements which it's on publishers to deal with, and those often revolve around editors needing to be able to find reviewers quickly. So Kim mentioned reviewers who are available, and that's a really, obviously we want to send papers to reviewers who do actually have the time to review and to do that quickly. We're going to come on, I know, to about speed of peer review, but there are things that publishers can do to have tools to help editors find those reviewers quickly and rapidly, and to get reviews back quickly as well. I think that's the main pinch point in the process that publishers can help tackle.
All right, I think we'll do the next question. So this question is to Krishna. During the pandemic, the peer review process has been under immense pressure due to the sheer number of submissions that authors have been sending across the journals. According to you, what are some of the challenges that are faced by reviewers at journals as well as editors in this regard? Now, yeah.
Sure. So I think most, as you say, most of the publishers mentioned a sudden increase in the number of submissions during the pandemic, and I think just dealing with the sheer number of submissions coming in, and the more submissions for editors to assess, and more requests to review for reviewers were received, and I think the editors and reviewers faced personal challenges during the pandemic that are similar to you and me, with having to deal with the challenges of working from home, having to balance childcare, homeschooling and whatnot, and really trying to balance that out with an increased workload and what is still perceived as almost a non-essential academic task that they normally perform in their free time, almost, right? So I think that was one obvious challenge, and I think also the thing to remember is that many of the editors and reviewers also are clinicians, and so their clinical duties also increased during the pandemic. We had several editors writing to us saying the hospital I'm working is overwhelmed with patients, so I'll try to get to my submissions at the end of the day, and it's really hard to argue with reasons like that. And so I think it is unsurprising, unfortunately, that things just took a little bit longer for reviews and editors. I mean, I think for reviewers, we also have to think that if we assume that most of the researchers already do their duty as peer reviewers in normal times, it means that the pool of available reviewers was sort of already limited. And in addition to the fact that, of course, experts with COVID-19 related knowledge was limited, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. I think another challenge really that the editors and the reviewers face, and maybe that's one of the most philosophical one, if you will, was really to balance out the moral imperative to share the research outputs that that they receive as early as possible, together with their duty and their responsibility as reviewers and editors to ensure the integrity of the articles that they see. I mean, no one wants to impede the rapid dissemination of research results, especially when they could be useful, when they could be life-saving and influence maybe global decisions. I mean, some of the way we and other publishers have addressed that was to support initiatives promoting the early sharing of COVID-19 relevant research and data even during the peer review. And for example, so we are signatories with others of the consensus statement by the Wellcome Trust. And some of the commitments are that when a paper related to COVID-19 is submitted to one of our journals, if the authors agree, we share the paper immediately with the World Health Organization, so that the WHO has rapid access to findings even that are emerging, and so that it could potentially aid the global response. And in parallel, we also recommend to authors to deposit their papers in a preprint server, for example, so that researchers outside the WHO also have access to the results. And all of this is happening while peer review is progressing. And it relieves some of the pressure maybe that the editors and the reviewers may have felt to be quicker than usual, and because the information is available, is publicly available, so that they can focus on assessing rigorously and helping to improve the manuscript. As you mentioned, I think there's still the challenge of finding reviewers that have the suitable expertise relevant to COVID-19. And I think there are some initiatives looking at sort of building, I think some led by some members of OASPA, to build a rapid reviewer list, and sort of reviews would sign up to a list, and that includes early career researchers, as you were mentioning earlier. And so those reviewers would sort of commit to rapid reviewing time, and also agree upfront that their reviews and their identity could be shared among publishers and journals if the submission were to change or to transfer from one journal to the other for any reason, and as is often the case. And really the point is sort of to move things a little bit quickly, and have people commit to that goal, at the same time ensuring that things are properly assessed. Another very pragmatic example is that the reviewers face was also the challenge of them assessing papers, and while knowing that the authors were stuck at home, and particularly in the life sciences, asking, for instance, for additional revisions while you are reviewing a paper was almost, sort of saying, okay, your paper is not going to come out in the next month because obviously, people would not be able to go to their lab or access their samples, for instance. So I think it has led to reviewers, editors really rethinking a little bit about, only asking for additional experiments that were critical to the conclusions of the paper. And some might argue that should always be the case in normal times, but I think that is something that was particularly important during the pandemic. So I think the challenges that the editors and the reviewers face, everything boils down to how to find the right balance between rapid dissemination of research while at the same time ensuring rigor, integrity, and reproducibility. And so in the end, it's a little bit about how to mitigate potential risks.
Exactly. Just to add to that, Krishna, I think this global pandemic has brought all the major publishers together in a global collaboration, to work on research that is COVID related and release that out to the general public and get it published as soon as possible. I think that is an amazing contribution that has happened in this industry because of the pandemic. We'll now move on to the next question. Now this question, we'll pass it on to Michael first and then to Krishna. Now, Michael, in the wake of this pandemic, we have observed that there is an increase in the number of submissions. One second, sorry. There's been a surge in the number of submissions as well as retractions, including preprints. To what extent do you agree that the review process was diluted or was performed with less robustness? Now, again, this is one of the questions that is part of our survey. As you can see, the initial data from our survey. This is one of the challenges where the survey respondents felt like these were some of the challenges that stood out in the peer review process. A very long waiting time in general, very slow reviews for any research that was not COVID-19 related, as well as from a reviewer point of view, they felt that they were getting too many reviews. There were too many reviews and too few reviewers. Michael, would you like to add your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. I would take issue, actually, I don't think there has been a surge in retractions, I would say. I looked at Retraction Watch earlier today, and there have only been only 33 retractions of preprints and published articles, which is still 33 papers, but in the big scheme of things, that's a tiny fraction. Retractions aren't themselves a bad thing. They do show that science is self-correcting. There's a very high-profile one in the Lancet about hydroxychloroquine that was retracted, and what that showed was that that science is self-correcting, and also it's commendable that the Lancet went to tighten up its editorial processes and its peer review processes to create a greater self-correcting mechanism, if you like. Krishna talked about mitigating potential risks, and I think the way the Lancet handled that has been exemplary. Was it Robert Lefkowitz, the chemistry Nobel Prize winner, said science is 99% failure, and that's an optimistic view. I think what we've seen is a sense in which we, for the public at large, have been able to see that science isn't just everything set in stone, nice and neat. There's lots of grey around science. But back to the question as well, I think higher speed doesn't necessarily correlate to lower quality. An editor just commented to me last week that some of the best reviewers that he had in his journal were actually the ones who were also the most rapid reviewers. So you can have speed and quality at the same time, that they're not mutually exclusive. I also don't think I buy the argument that requesting a shorter turnaround time in peer review in itself leads to less rigorous review, because you've still got to spend the same amount of time reviewing if you're going to do that paper justice. So, and I think this is actually really heightened when you've got COVID research being under scrutiny here. The stakes are enormous. Being able to pass judgment on a paper which potentially has massive health outcomes is a really serious business. And I don't think reviewers who have reviewed COVID-19 research, just because they've been asked to do it rapidly, are doing, they're not lowering their standards. I don't feel, there's certainly no evidence that that's the case. they won't want to sign off on poor quality work, given how significant it is. I think rapid review is really a question about how you manage your time and how you manage competing demands and workloads. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts on the question, really. I think, sorry, just one more thing, there is evidence, and there was a preprint about this that looked at 14 journals showing that the peer review process for papers during the pandemic, in the first few months at least, was faster. Those are medical journals. So, there is evidence to show that for COVID papers, things have been going faster. But yeah, again, it comes back to that question of whether speed necessarily correlates to lower quality, and I don't think it does.
Krishna, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I mean, I agree, Michael. I think that speed is probably not the only component of the retractions that we've seen, on papers or preprints related to COVID. I think another thing is really the lack of knowledge. I mean, that right at the beginning of the pandemic, and even still now, we might argue, we didn't know much about the virus. We didn't know much about the clinical science, how to treat it, etc. And I think that, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, the feeling was also that any information, any piece of knowledge about the virus or the disease might prove useful, to someone somewhere. And so I think that, now that we have more context, we are able to sort of revisit and review this, this data. But at the time, without other additional information, it might have been difficult to sort of say, this is incorrect and this should not be published. And so I wonder if that was also, one of the reasons why we've seen some of the retractions. And I think the fact also that there was a lack of knowledge also led to people being maybe more likely to make mistakes or to make incorrect assumptions just because they don't have enough data to put their results into context, and maybe to see potential correlations even though they only had limited data and they couldn't really compare it to other settings, for instance, out there, which would normally be the case in sort of a standard research. And I think the other thing that I'd like to note is that's particularly true for some of the preprints that were published. The authors sometimes themselves may have been very careful in their conclusions and may have stated the limitations of their findings very in a transparent way, but others may have rushed to interpret that as a basis maybe for further research or even treatment in certain cases, or may have rushed to present these results as solid clinical evidence and without the proper context. So I think this has also played a part in maybe some of the retractions that we've seen.
All right, thank you for that answer, Krishna. We'll move on to the next question, which is for Kim. So in your opinion, which forms of peer review are most effective in building trust in this peer review process? Again, one of the questions from our survey, and this is a brief idea of all the different types of peer review that we have listed in the survey. All the attendees that are interested in taking the survey can use the link that is there in the chat box. So as we can see from this survey, our respondents have mentioned that they feel double-blind peer review is the best form that has the most amount of trust. What do you think about this, Kim?
Yeah, I would agree. To be honest, I come from a social science background where double-blind is the standard. When I moved into STM, single-blind was typically the standard when I started my STM publishing career. And it surprised me a little bit, I'll be honest. But I think what we've seen in that time is that there's been a move to either fully open peer review, so where everybody is named and everything is sort of made transparently available, or peer review is fully anonymous. I think single blind sort of is almost the worst of every system, and actually your poll suggests the same. It's consistently rated in surveys as an unpopular choice. But I think in science journals that's how the journal was started. And I think academics and publishers are probably not the fastest to change. And as a result, we have a huge number of journals that still employ this single blind method, even though there is increasing evidence that it's unpopular. And it's one of the reasons we, as IOP Publishing, have announced just a couple of weeks ago that we will be transitioning all our journals over to the double blind method by the end of next year. That's as a result of our own surveys and data and analysis, but also of looking at the literature. And there is increasing evidence of either perceptions of bias in review, again, your survey highlighted that as well, or actually evidence of bias now appears to be coming out through a number of studies. And so I think, for me, double blind is the method of choice, acknowledging that it's not perfect. There is no perfect system, and it's also really important to say that the system is only as good as the people who use it. If people are inclined or incentivized to manipulate the system in some way, they will do. Having said that, I think as publishers we have a responsibility to make that system as equitable as possible, and double blind is a good way of doing that. There is evidence, just to sort of talk about open peer review for a moment, there is evidence that this is a really popular method. However, talking to early career researchers in particular, there are some hesitations there, and that really seems to come from a fear of reprisal. So if, for example, an early career researcher is writing a report and they can see that the author of that report is somebody quite senior in their field, the early career researcher understandably might have some hesitation about submitting a critical, making some criticisms of that report. And so we do see evidence that suggests that early career researchers are less comfortable with the open model. And for that reason, that's why one of the reasons that factored into our decision to go to double blind. I would just say, though, that what we're trying to do at IOP is actually merge two kind of peer review systems together in a way. So what we're talking about doing is double blind pre-publication. So all parties are anonymous. We think that's the most objective and equitable system that there is available. But then post-publication, what we're trying to do is move all our journals to transparent peer review. So that is publishing the reports and publishing the author responses to those reports with the paper, so that readers can see the provenance of that paper, the journey it's been through, the reports that have gone with that paper, and the changes that have been made. So we think that's the most objective method of peer review pre-publication, but it allows also for maximum transparency post-publication. And that for us is a really nice complement that we think is kind of the utopia of peer review, all the while acknowledging that no system is perfect and there are absolutely flaws, 100%. A couple of other things besides the peer review model. Reviewer education is so important. It's typical that reviewers aren't taught how to do a review. It's just expected that it's part of academic life. And I think that's something that we as publishers, and I would also hope that institutions go some way to providing some reviewer education, because I think that's really, really important. We also have a responsibility as editors and as publishers to not allow inappropriate comments to get through to authors. I think that really has an impact on trust in peer review. And also we have a responsibility as publishers to take quick and decisive action when errors are found. So Michael and Kristen has talked about retractions earlier, and I think as publishers we really have to take that responsibility very seriously to correct that scientific record when errors, mistakes are found. So I think it goes beyond the model. The model is very important, but there are additional actions that we as publishers can take to ensure that the trust in peer review is maximised.
All right. I think I agree to what you said, Kim. I'd just like to add to that, first of all, it's a great initiative for all authors that are looking to publish in IOP Publishing, that they have, this availability of double-blind peer review as well as post-publication peer review, as you mentioned. However, I do have come across instances previously, where reviewers have been able to identify in the double-blind system itself, or reviewers have been able to identify these authors. And do you think, at that kind can lead to a bias in the review process?
Yeah, it's impossible to, in the age of Google and preprints, especially archiving the physics community, it's impossible to fully blind all manuscripts. I think we have to accept that that is not something we're ever going to be able to do. What we're doing is putting our trust in the reviewers, the people that we ask to validate this science and to constructively improve it. We are putting our trust in those reviewers to not go looking for those identities. Sometimes it's inevitable, you can find it, but we would hope that, and we hold our reviewers to that high standard, that the first thing they're going to do when they're asked to review a manuscript is they're not going to go and hurriedly try and find out who that author is. Good science should stand on merit alone, regardless of who published it. An early career researcher is just as capable of publishing a good paper as a senior professor, that's been in the field for 30 years. And so who that person is, the reputation of that person, the institution of that person, any kind of protected characteristics, so thinking about gender or race, it really shouldn't matter. Science should be judged on its merit. And we think that moving to double blind, accepting that it's not a perfect system, is one of the ways to address that.
Right. Yes, I think we'll move to the next question. Now this question, we'll start with Krishna and then come back to you, Kim. Krishna, according to you, how are journals dealing with unscrupulous practices by authors? For example, suggesting fake reviewers?
Yes, I think generally journals are dealing with that by having strong and detailed editorial policies so that they can clearly explain what is acceptable and what is not, and also how issues are dealt with to inform authors that their paper may be rejected, that publishers might publish an expression of concern, they might retract the papers even, so that authors are really informed about the consequences of such action. And so just to give a few examples of what detailed editorial policies might be. I mean, for instance, the one that we have on figure manipulation that some other journals also have is to, for instance, ask the authors for the original raw uncropped blots or gels to be submitted as supplementary files upon submission, so that you would sort of prevent the use of fake blots, for instance, to provide the controls on the same blot, for instance, and to indicate on all the blots the number of biological repeats, for instance, that they use. So really to give more information and to make it harder for sort of fake data to be there in this example of the blots. And I think, for instance, you mentioned the fake reviewer issue, which was sort of authors giving real names but fake email addresses or fake contact details of real people with real expertise. I think this has led to many journals forbidding actually authors to even suggest potential reviewers for their own papers. To be honest, in addition to sort of the fake, the potential for fake reviews, several studies have also shown that reviews that were suggested by authors were more likely to provide a positive report anyway. So there are other issues relating to that, and also potential conflict of interest. I mean, we mentioned at the beginning, some of which might be hard for people to be aware of. And so, for instance, also for journals that still accept, for instance, reviews suggested by authors, there were some maybe additional information that could be requested to sort of increase the chances of having the actual person and the actual contact details. It might be to ask for an institutional email address instead of a personal one, though of course we have to appreciate that some institutions don't have email addresses, or some people, because they move frequently, might use their personal address. So there are some caveats to that, but also we've also asked for reviewers to provide additional information that may help identify them, and one of that is more widely used, is to ask for an ORCID ID. So really, an ORCID ID which would provide a persistent digital identifier that would help identify a researcher among others, together with the contact details, together with the names, would sort of help to sort of avoid the case of fake reviewers. And I think more generally, it has to be recognized that peer review alone is not currently able to handle unscrupulous practices such as these. I think we have to remember that peer review is based on the premise that authors, that peers are presenting their research in good faith, right? I mean, we are meant to believe what they tell us, what they present, and it's almost impossible to know exactly all the things that happened during their research. And so I think it's not realistic to expect reviewers or editors to suddenly become experts in identifying all these unscrupulous practices. Especially when these tend to become more and more varied and more elaborate. And so I think in addition to having strong and detailed editorial policies, I think having maybe a dedicated team or person look into those publication ethics issues. It could be internal, it could be external. Could help also address those things, because if people are trained to really focus on publication ethics issues, for instance, just because they see they have a general oversight of the papers, they see more papers, they might see all of the programs, and they might be more likely to see trends. Of course, there are challenges with that, and I mean, as a sort of a small, medium-sized publisher, I mean, we don't necessarily have the means to have a whole team dedicated to publication ethics, and so one also have to see that there are challenges, and unscrupulous authors are becoming more and more creative and imaginative, and so I think it feels also that we might have a new policy to address maybe the fake reviewers or the figure manipulation aspect, but there will be new things, and so we're sort of also fighting against always finding a solution to address that. And so I think that the system is seeing a lot of challenges there.
All right.
Yeah, I absolutely
Kim, what do you
agree.
think about
Sorry.
it?
Yeah,
That's
I
okay.
absolutely agree with everything that Krishna has said there. It's no system is ever perfect, and it's too much. It's unrealistic to expect reviewers and editors to know exactly the circumstances in which every paper has been brought about. But I think there are things that we can encourage, such as data availability statements, so that reviewers and editors and readers have access to the data, so that it can be interrogated more than it probably is at the moment. Technology really is our friend here. We are relying on technology like plagiarism software, like image screening, conflict of interest checkers. There is a huge amount of technology, and thankfully there is more technology coming out almost every year to help us identify these unscrupulous practices, but it's never going to be we're never going to be one step ahead. So I think it's about, like Krishna said, it's about awareness, it's about vigilance, it's about taking fast action, and making it known that there are consequences for misconduct. It's not something that should be taken lightly. Careers are made unbroken very easily when misconduct allegations arise. So I think there's also a role for us to highlight what the consequences are of that misconduct. But yeah, Krishna covered pretty much everything there.
Just to add to that, is it so at IOP Publishing as well as at Kargar Publishers? Do authors really need to suggest reviewers for their papers, or is it a requirement for the journals?
So it's optional for us. We allow authors to suggest reviewers, but we don't always use them. We will always try and use our own reviewers that we find ourselves first. But sometimes it can be really helpful if it's a field that perhaps is on the periphery of one of our subject disciplines for that journal. For example, if it's interdisciplinary, and there is a field that we're not so experienced in, or we don't have contacts in that field, a suggested reviewer can be really useful. We will always try to contact that suggested reviewer, like Krishna said. We will try to contact them through an institutional email address, even if a non-institutional email address is what's been provided by the author, as a means of trying to sort of rule out the potential that the person isn't who they say they are. We will also look into the background of that reviewer, so we'll look quite carefully at what they've published, what institution they're affiliated with, and really reassure ourselves. We will never use a suggested reviewer on their own. We will always use a reviewer that we've found through our own means, because as Krishna says, there is evidence to suggest that suggested reviewers can be more lenient, and it's in our interest as publishers to make sure that the reviews are objective as much as possible.
Yes, similar to Kim, so it is also optional for most of our journals to suggest reviewers, and as Kim says, in some cases, I mean, we provide detailed instructions as to what those reviews do. I mean, you mentioned the selection criteria at the beginning, so we do give them, and some others do a good job in actually following all the criteria and suggest really good people. So that can be helpful, especially in certain fields, as Kim mentioned. But we really tell the authors that it is in the end at the discretion of the editor to make the call whether those suggestions are appropriate or not. And in all cases, similarly to what you mentioned, we would not use only suggested reviews, reviews suggested by the authors alone.
Is it the same at Wiley, Mike?
I just take myself off mute. Yes, yeah. We publish 1,700 journals, so there's a whole range of practices, as you can imagine. But I guess the majority have the option to suggest reviewers. There are some cases where that's mandatory. Yeah.
All right. We'll move to the next question. And I'll pass this question on to Kim. According to you, how is reviewer misconduct handled?
Sorry, I'm on mute. Typical. Yeah, so we've covered a lot of, or some of this answer anyway. Reviewer misconduct is something that's probably not talked about as much as author misconduct. And it's important to acknowledge that there are lots of different forms of reviewer misconduct. So a couple that I'll touch on briefly. Asking authors to heavily cite your own work would be considered misconduct, especially if those citations are not relevant to the paper. Not declaring a conflict of interest could be declared as misconduct, including unprofessional content within your review. So there have been a number of papers published recently, and there are some very interesting Twitter accounts where people can post unprofessional reviewer comments that they've received. It's really quite alarming, some of the comments that people have received, going as far as sexism and racism, which we are absolutely committed to stamping out of academia. There is no place for that in academia or in peer review. And so I think, like I said before, we need to make people aware of the consequences for that kind of action, that it will be noticed, it will be acted upon. Those kind of sanctions might include informing their employer of their actions. We reserve the right not to work with anybody that is found guilty of misconduct. In terms of how we would handle it on the paper itself, we would always try and edit the reviewer report if we found inappropriate content within the reviewer report. We may actually choose not to use that reviewer report altogether. That is at the editor's discretion. I would say that we don't do that often, but we reserve the right to do that if needed. I think the main thing that we would like to do, though, is focus on education. And I know I've talked about this before, but I think reviewers don't really receive much training in how to do peer review. And I think we and the institutions where researchers are based have some responsibility there to provide better reviewer education so that people don't make these mistakes, because I don't believe they're always intentional. And so if we can educate people about what is an acceptable reviewer comment, then I think we're all heading towards better science. So we take that responsibility quite seriously. I mentioned earlier that we've just rolled out a reviewer education program this week, and I would encourage anybody to go and have a look at our website or our Twitter account to go and find out more information about that. But yeah, again, like I said, making people aware of the consequences of this kind of action is sadly one of the best deterrents that we have.
So basically, educating reviewers, especially early career researchers that want to review for journals, educating them about the peer review process and the consequences that could happen if they happen to do any kind of misconduct, is important, which I do agree.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, let's move on to the next question. So Michael, this one is for you. According to you, do you think standardization of the review process and related parameters would decrease the inconsistencies in the review report? Now, this also ties in with some of the suggestions that we have received from survey respondents for our survey. I've highlighted only a few of them over here, as you can see. These were the ones that stood out according to us. Monetary compensation or a certification for issuance to reviewers. The option, which this was an odd one out, the option to challenge the reviewers to minimize bias in any form in the review process, as well as they feel like just how authors publish, research papers and they get credibility because of that. Peer reviewers should also get accredited similar to, authors that publish research work. So what do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it is true there's no standardized way of doing peer review. There are certain things that we think should be done in a peer review. There's a question about this actually that I've seen on the chat that I've responded to about the different elements of peer review that reviewers should be looking at. But we often make assumptions around these. There is inconsistency. I mean, it is true as well that peer review happens not just in journal publishing. It's part of the research ecosystem, if you like, isn't it? It happens at grant funding, it happens with conference abstract selection. So researchers are familiar with the whole concept of peer review. And if we're tackling anything about peer review, I think we need to take a holistic approach to it. So we would need to look at, the interests of funders, institutions, as well as publishers to agree on what peer review entails and how we can improve the quality and consistency of peer review. That's my first point. I think standardization would, of course, help authors with improving their articles, but of course, journals have different priorities in mind and different scopes, and you wouldn't really be able to get 100% standardization. Would a journal be only looking at soundness of science, or would it also be looking at novelty, scope, and so on? And we said that at Wiley, we've embarked on a project to provide a consistent reviewer score sheet that we can roll out across multiple journals, and there are benefits to authors in that it helps with transferring articles from one journal to another. So if your article is rejected at journal A, it's very easily portable to journal B, and the editors can see, they get a sense of consistency in the way that the article has been peer reviewed, and that reduces wastage in peer review, which is a real bane, actually, the amount of wasted reviewer time there is in peer review. So I think there are virtues in standardizing things, and there are certainly benefits to authors in that. I think on the slide, the responses on the slide seem to focus mainly on incentives to reviewers. And I think what seems to be clear from surveys that I'm familiar with is that reviewers do tend to value recognition and appreciation more than reward, but also, yeah, there should be, peer review is part of the scientific enterprise, and it really should be credited in a way that it isn't at the moment. I think it's sort of shocking, really, almost, that peer reviewers can do that, can add that value to research that's published, can add that value to work that gets looked at and improves research, but not get any credit for it. So we, and I know other, IAPP, and I'm not sure about CAGA, but we've partnered with Publons to help reviewers get some sort of credit. We do reviewer certificates every year, that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, there are platforms like Publons and reviewer credits, that do allow peer reviewers to get some form of, certification or credits for the work that they are doing. However, from the overwhelming response that we've got for this survey and, some of the suggestions, we've noticed that, although, as you mentioned, I do agree that, peer reviewers are looking more towards recognition for the work that they are doing, rather than the monetary compensations or technically from that point of view. However, from the results that we are evaluating within the team, we've noticed that this seems to be a rising concern, a rising request among peer reviewers for monetary compensation over and above the recognition that they get from the publishers. Kim and Krishna, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. You're right. There is an increasing amount of noise around potentially monetizing peer review, and there's a movement. I think it's the 450 movement, which is gaining some traction on social media. I think I absolutely agree. Peer review should be rewarded and recognised. There is no question about that. I think I do still have some concerns, however, about monetizing peer review. I think how do you, for example, distinguish between a one-line review and a two-page review? Should they be compensated the same? Should we start assigning scores to say, oh, this review was worthy of this amount of money, but that review was worthy of that amount of money? I think that's quite problematic. I think it also creates a potential problem around why people perform peer review in the first place, and if those if the incentive to do peer review is potentially muddied by monetary reward, I query whether peer review will remain as objective as we would all like it to be. I think if people are performing peer reviews, frequently and quickly and potentially sloppily in order to make monetary gain, that is not in the best interest of anybody participating in science. So I'm not saying I don't agree with the principle that reviewers should be rewarded for the efforts that they put into the peer review system, but I remain to be convinced that a cash payment is the answer there. And I would agree with what Michael said, that we actually did a report just a few weeks ago where we asked reviewers about recognition systems and incentives, and cash just isn't featuring highly. You're right, it's growing, but it's still nowhere near what people seem to value more highly, which is recognition, feedback on their work. A thank you, it sounds ridiculous, but a thank you goes an incredibly long way, and we still have improvements to make as publishers to make sure that we do recognise the work of reviewers.
Yes, if I can briefly add to that, I mean, I agree with the concerns that Kim raised regarding monetary compensation, but I wonder if the increased discussion that you mentioned about monetary compensation is not a way to sort of go around the fact that at the moment peer review is not rewarded, not recognized as an essential academic activity, right? And I wonder if it was to be part of the expected academic output that one would do, along with publishing papers, along with teaching courses and things like that. Maybe that would sort of be indirectly equivalent to a monetary compensation, because that would be part of what they are meant to do as a researcher, as an academics. And so I wonder if maybe addressing the issue really at how this is recognized. I mean, initiatives like Publons, like ORCID, are helpful, but it's also, if we are talking about monetary compensation, and those are the things that are at the mind of researchers, it means it's working with institutions, with funders, to really recognize that not just as a bonus, but as really, this is part of your work. This is not only in terms of compensation, but also in terms of time. I mean, we talked originally that usually reviewers do that in their free time almost, so that should be sort of recognized as part of their responsibilities and their duties as researchers.
All right. There are some other suggestions as well. I'll just list down a few of them, that we've got from our respondents. Some of them have mentioned, requiring more time and dedication towards reviewing of the papers. Also, some reviewers felt that there should be better matching of papers based on the skills that these reviewers have, and maybe journals and publishers should look at technologies like artificial intelligence to aid in the matching of skills to the respective peer reviewers. Another important suggestion from a lot of the respondents was training and effective delivery, how to basically write a peer review report, or what are the type of aspects that I should look at when I'm reviewing a paper. So that was one important thing. And finally, some respondents felt that there should be a broadly accepted marking system or a reviewing system to increase consistency among journals, because each journal and publisher has a different varied system for peer review. So they felt that there should be a standardized system in some form for marking and review. All right. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kim and Krishna, for an informative and amazing session. Our attendees have certainly gained a lot of critical information from this panel discussion. We would once again like to thank all the attendees as well for joining this discussion. We would definitely request you to please fill the feedback survey, which will be displayed after you leave this session. Your participation will allow us to evaluate the effectiveness of our future webinars. I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.